Um, I used to work with Brandon, and he is a really, really smart and interesting guy. And I've watched many of his presentations to the Metropolitan Board. And so this is going to be really interesting. He's been with Met for over 25 years. He's involved in the long-term water resource planning strategy and policy development for Met. He has had a key role in development of a lot of Met strategic water plans, including the Integrated Water Resources Plan, the Urban Water Management Plan, the Water Surplus and Drought Management Plan, and the Water Supply Allocation Plan that comes into play if there's actually rationing. And so with that, I'm so excited to hear an update from Brandon on how climate change is factoring into the planning for reliable water supplies into the future. Thank you for coming, Brandon.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's funny, I just realized if I've been here for more than 25 years, this is actually my 29th year, which is crazy when I think about it. But so I've been at Met in planning, for that entire time, actually, and I've gotten to participate or see every integrated resources planning process that we've had at Met. I've gotten to see at least part of the very first one back in the early 90s to all the way to the one we just recently finished. And climate change and other uncertainties have been something that we've worked along the way to incorporate into our planning. And so that's the opportunity to talk to all of you today and show you what we've been doing over the last really, I would say it's 10 over 10 years that we've been incorporating this kind of look at climate change and what it means for water resources and water reliability for Southern California. So with that, I'll start into the presentation. And so water and climate change, planning for uncertainty, that's what I'm going to talk about today, tonight. And I'm going to try to do this in 3 parts because there's a lot of stuff going on when it comes to planning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Metropolitan Water District and who we are. I think a lot of times that helps to set the context for the way we look at planning and uncertainty. And then second, I'll talk about the evolution of uncertainty planning in terms of how we've incorporated that into our planning processes. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about our latest 2020 IRP and the methodology, the scenario planning methodology that we chose to try and capture and plan for these climate change uncertainties, because it really has been a shift, but I think a growth from what we've done, over the last decade. So Metropolitan and its scope. So who is Metropolitan? So we are a water wholesaler, the water wholesaler for Southern California. And so that means we do not serve direct retail water to end use customers like households or businesses. Rather, we have 26 member agencies that we provide water to. Most times it's supplemental water, but sometimes it's their entire water supply. 26 member agencies, and those member agencies essentially have the right to buy water from Metropolitan to add to their water supplies. And so sometimes some of those agencies are cities, some of those agencies are municipalities that cover multiple cities, and we have some wholesalers that, so we're a wholesaler and then they're a wholesaler, and so they deliver water to their retail purveyors within their service area. We have 19 plus, and I'm not a big fan of the accuracy of population counts, so somewhere 19, 20, 21 million people in our service area, I think is a good way to think about it. But there's a great many people in our service area, but our service area covers a wide area, 5,200 square miles of our service area where population served. And I think we're one of the largest landholders in California because of all of the right-of-way and facilities and other things that we've done all along the Colorado River, et cetera. In terms of water supply, that 5,200 square mile area and the 19 plus million people and the associated businesses or agriculture or residential use uses somewhere between 3 and 4 million acre feet of water. And remember, an acre foot is 326,000 gallons. And they say that's roughly enough to serve 2 to 3 families for a year, 1 acre foot is. And so, again, I use a wide range there of 3 to 4 million acre feet because we have seen big changes in the end result of water use year to year. And so as people are becoming more efficient with their water use, whether it's because they're just not using water behaviorally during droughts, or whether they're installing water efficient devices like low flow toilets or more efficient irrigation systems, we've seen the demand drop. So that's why there's a wide range there in the 3 to 4 million acre feet. About half of it, and of course that number is going to vary too, is provided by MWD. So a significant piece of the water supply for Southern California is provided by Metropolitan Water District, the water wholesaler. Where does this water come from? And so I think you can see at the bottom of your screen, the yellow piece, that's the Metropolitan Water District service area in the context of all of California. And a lot of the water comes from there. There's groundwater supplies, which Kathy Kunis was the expert at Metropolitan about groundwater supplies in Southern California. There's groundwater supplies where water's pumped from underground aquifers that are managed. There's an increasing amount of water recycling that goes on, and surface water diversions, particularly in San Diego. So snow and rain, running off and then being diverted. So again, that's a big piece of the locally supplied water. And to that is a major piece that is the Los Angeles aqueduct. So you can see from, about the middle of the state there, on the east side of California, there's an arrow that says Los Angeles aqueducts. The city of Los Angeles built these aqueducts back in the early 1900s, and they have delivered over the last century, a significant amount of water to the city of LA. And when we count that as locally supplied water or water that doesn't need to be provided by Metropolitan, those are the supplies that make up about half of that total water use in Southern California. So the groundwater, the surface water, the Los Angeles aqueduct water. So Metropolitan was formed in 1928, basically, with the primary purpose of building the Colorado River Aqueduct, an aqueduct to bring water from the Colorado River and the newly built or going to be built Hoover Dam and Lake Mead from that system. And so that's one source of the imported water from Metropolitan. In the 1960s, 1970s, we entered into the state water contract to deliver water through the California State Water Project. And so that water comes through the California Aqueduct, and you can see that going from Metropolitan service area up north to the area that I have marked there as Bay Delta. So the State Water Project, there's 29 contractors. Metropolitan is the largest. We draw water from the Sacramento Bay Delta, or the project does anyways, which originates in the Sierra Mountains, and you can see that over kind of in the northeast there. And so that's the other source of imported water. And then over the years, Metropolitan has built a vast array of storage, both underground storage and surface reservoir storage, to the point where we have about 5.5 million acre feet of total storage capacity to store water that when we have water in excess of what our demands are, to deliver that water in years that we have less than what our demands are. And so those are the sources of water from California. Since this is a climate change kind of impacts presentation, I give you this next slide also, which shows how far and wide the actual watersheds that feed the two imported supplies really are, right? So this is a better view of the Northern Sierra, and the distance, you're talking about the aqueduct itself, the California aqueduct is about 270 miles from that Bay Delta area to Southern California. And so even further north of that is the watershed where the rain and snow falls, feeds the rivers that go into that Bay Delta estuary for water supply. The California Aqueduct and the State Water Project is not the only user of Delta water. The Central Valley Project, which is a federal project primarily serving agricultural customers in Central California, also diverts water from that Bay Delta. And I think that there's a statistic that 66% of water used in California comes through the Bay Delta. So a significant source of the water is in that Bay Delta. And again, that system is driven primarily through rain and snow, right? Same thing on the Colorado River Basin. This graphic attempts to show that the Colorado River Aqueduct, which is 242 miles from the border of Arizona, California, and Nevada, really has its source in the upper Colorado River Basin. The majority of the snow that feeds the runoff into the Colorado River falls essentially in Colorado, in Utah, and New Mexico, right? And so that water is coming from a long way away when you consider the water source, which is, the snow and the rain, right? More amounts are added through river systems, all the way, basically all the way into Nevada, but the majority of it comes from that snow and rain in the upper Colorado River Basin. So why do I bring that up? Because climate change is not only, it's going to have a different effect in these different areas because they're so geographically spread and so, so different in terms of their geography that, it's really impossible to talk about what is climate change and how's it going to affect Metropolitan, right? You have to kind of think about it in terms of our sources of water and even within our service area. So this graph, which I will say, as I was reviewing this graphic or this presentation before I came on, I realized I sent you one with a different title on this. It makes some more sense with this title. So when you see your PDF, it's going to have a different title that talks about runoff. But I think what I really wanted to show you with this graphic is that, the California water system basically, or everybody's water system for that matter, runs off of the water cycle, right? And the water cycle basically means that it's evaporation from surface water, including the oceans, lakes, streams. That evaporation is what feeds the atmospheric cloud conditions, right? Along with, you can see the transpiration from plants, right? As they basically exhale moisture, goes into the air, condenses into clouds, moves over and falls in the form of rain or snow, and then runs off into rivers or infiltrates groundwater basins. And then it all starts over again. So that water cycle, I saw a quote the other day, I don't know how true it is, or not the other day, through my career, that there's no new water in the world. Every drop of water has been here from the beginning and will be here to the end because it is a cycle, right? It doesn't disappear. It gets used and then evaporates and then falls again as rainfall. And so the new title for, the title here is Climate Change Impacts on Increased Warming and Precipitation Affect the Water Cycle and then affect the ability to use the water systems to take advantage of that water, of that water cycle in terms of its sources. And so I want to focus in really on temperature, increased warming and precipitation, whether it's the type of precipitation, rain versus snow, or the quantity of precipitation, kind of equivalent inches of water, or the pattern in which that precipitation falls during the year, all can have significant effects on the ability of a water system to effectively capture, divert, deliver water supplies as we go out in changing conditions. So how do we incorporate that into planning for water reliability in Southern California? And so this next phase of the presentation, I'm going to try and explain a little bit about how we deal with uncertainty planning to begin with, and then how we fit climate change as an uncertainty into that uncertainty planning. As you could imagine, trying to plan what it is that you need to develop or maintain involves a lot of different components, right? And so at Metropolitan, over the years, we've developed a number of different ways to try and account for or project or forecast the different important components of what ultimately makes up water supply reliability. So in order to look at water supply reliability, we have to know our sources of water. And so those locally supplied sources of water that Metropolitan doesn't own and operate, we need to have information about what those things are producing, how they're affected, how to project what it's going to be in the future. And so we use local supply surveys and interactions with our member agencies and local agencies about their water supplies, or the managers of the groundwater basins, et cetera. And we essentially put all that information into models that help us organize and project future local supply availability, right? Much in the same way, we need to estimate essentially like how people use water in the future. So I have that box that says conservation savings, right? So to me, conservation is a structural kind of a structural approach to using water more efficiently. So when I think of conservation, I think of things like low flow toilets. So when I look at toilets in the pre-1990s, toilets that used to flush 6 gallons per flush. So, same use, go to the restroom, flush the toilet 6 gallons. Now toilets are 1 gallon of flush, basically. So that is, to me, conservation, right? You have the same end use, more efficient water use. So the more of those toilets we can put in, the more that we save 5 gallons per flush on each toilet, right? And so you get the same kind of demand for the use of water, but you can use less water using it. And I'm just juxtaposing that against what I think a lot of people think of as conservation, which is behavioral conservation that occurs during times of drought. When there's shortages and there's a drought, people say, hey, we need to save water, right? Back in I think it was the 80s drought, right? If it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down, right? Those are behavioral changes. That's saying don't flush your toilet, right? Or only flush your toilet when you need to. That's a different kind of thing. That's a behavioral change that I kind of consider that short-term conservation, and it's not lasting. Structural conservation is lasting, right? So we want to estimate the amount of structural conservation that's going on. So we do that, and we have planning models for that too. I have another box here that says retail demands, MWD Maine. That means nothing to nobody, except it's a name of a retail demand forecasting model, right? So over the years, again, we've developed a modeling methodology to estimate based on demographic and economic factors how much water we expect to be used at the retail level. So how much water, how much demand for water at the retail level that needs to be supplied by local supplies or imported supplies. And so we have models that have been developed that do that, right? Going to the middle column, we have Colorado River models to try to estimate what the conditions on the Colorado River would be. That's one of our imported supplies. We have down at the bottom an SWP, State Water Project model, to do the same thing. And ultimately, all of these things come together in this green box that I have named here, resource analysis and IRP sim. So IRP sim is like this really cool tool that we've developed that integrates all of the information that's developed through all of these other models, and basically is a simulator that says, when these conditions happen with the weather over time, what water is being used and how much water is being stored and how much water is being taken out of storage, and is basically able to tell us that under certain conditions, what the outcome of whether or not we're able to meet the demands for water that are there for that year, right?
So what does IRP stand for?
IRP is Integrated Resources Planning, and then the sim is simulation model. So it's basically integrated resources planning is what we've referred to our overall regional coordinated planning process that we do with our member agencies and our local agencies. And so this simulation model is in support of that overall integrated resources planning. So the important thing for today is to just keep in mind that, so we've spent a lot of time developing a really cool model that can help us give us an estimate of whether or not we have sufficient water supply or insufficient water supply, and how our resources are working under various conditions each year out into the future. Okay, so that's what IRP sim is, and you know, really this is leading towards how do the conditions of climate change those underlying conditions in which you're looking at whether or not you can meet supplies and demands, right? That's essentially the name of the game, is how do we incorporate that into IRP sim, right? So back in 2010, we teamed up with the RAND Corporation, and if you know the RAND Corporation, they're basically a highly technical think tank policy support group. They made their mark in basically defense, national defense, you know, kind of figuring out war strategies, things like that. But you know, they're
a federally funded, their FFRDC, federally funded research and development center, congressionally chartered with the Army as their sponsor.
Yep, that is.
They're one of our 36 national labs.
Yep, and they have expanded their scope to, you know, kind of expertise in overall uncertainty planning. And so back in again 2010, we partnered with the RAND Corporation because they had developed this technique for uncertainty planning called robust decision making. Robust decision making, and essentially what robust decision making was a way of incorporating and managing multiple sources of uncertainty into your planning approach. So the application for Metropolitan here was to define what are the different types of uncertainty that would affect our water resources balance and our ability to deliver water out into the future, right? And so with RAND's help, we developed this experimental design to be used within this robust decision-making analytical process. And we basically measured the impacts of uncertainty on demographic change in our service area over the next, you know, the planning horizon, so over 25 years out into the future. And so we incorporated 4 scenarios of growth, where growth in economic growth and population growth, and you know, basically, yeah, economic growth, you know, kind of refers to CII, commercial industrial kind of growth and water use. 4 different scenarios of how the region may grow differently, right? And we combined those ranges of uncertainty and demographics with climate conditions that were informed by 12 different climate scenarios generated by GCMs, or global circulation models, right? And so we use the output of 6 different global circulation models under 2 different emission scenarios. So the emission scenarios refers to basically the carbon loading in the atmosphere that underlies, global climate conditions. And these scenarios were used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And so again, this is back in 2012. So we used as a range of uncertainty in what future climate change might be. We use these 12 different climate scenarios as representative of the different changes that we might see. So we mixed that with the demographic changes and mixed that with 3 different scenarios of future Bay Delta conditions, since that was a big part of our future in terms of the State Water Project, with variations in local resources yields. So those local supplies that I talked about, right? Those have uncertainty in terms of how they're going to be able to produce in the future, whether that's because of, say, contaminants. We're seeing that today. Things like PFAS or TCP 123, trichloropropane. Those contaminants impact the amount of groundwater that can be used, right? And that's an uncertainty in the future. If we have less groundwater, then we're more likely to have more shortages, right? Because it's a significant part of our supplies. And then there is, the timing of all projects. So, just because agencies or we think that we might bring new projects online, the time in which we've been able to bring them online can vary. And so this experimental design, now think about it, what am I saying with this experimental design? All of the combinations of these factors that I have in this table, we basically incorporated and tested through our water simulation model, right? And basically what that resulted in, I'm going to skip this slide. Basically because this one just says we have this big, huge, fancy model and process now that could mix all of these uncertainties. Basically what it resulted in is nearly 7,000 combinations of outcomes year by year that incorporated these combinations of uncertainty in growth and climate and outcomes in the Bay Delta and project timing and local supply availability and yield. So we looked at 6,900 different what-if scenarios on an annual basis out through time. And what RAND was able to do for us is use something that they call scenario discovery to statistically go through all of those results and figure out what was the causes or the predominant causes for when we were essentially unable to either meet demands or to maintain a sufficient amount of storage reserves that lead to kind of future reliability. So that's a really complicated way of saying, how did we incorporate climate change? We took the best known information I would say the best known. We took a set or a sample of known information at the time, those models and the outcomes for temperature and precipitation, looked at them in the context of other major uncertainties that we were looking at, essentially did what if scenarios there. We found out when we got hurt, when we're not able to produce water or to have enough water to meet demands. And then we used statistical methods to understand why that was the case. So what that, what that kind of told us was a number of different things. Like at that time, 2 or more of those major uncertainties had to come out unfavorably for us to have a serious risk to our ability to provide water supply reliability. So in other words, if we had climate change that was described by the range of those models, if we had climate change, but there wasn't a high degree of demographic growth, nor a loss of local supplies, then we could manage the impacts of that range of climate change that we saw. But if two or more of those factors happen to turn out unfavorably, so we had bad climate change plus a lot of growth, particularly like in the Inland Empire where there's, where growth leads to higher demands because it's hotter and drier, then you started seeing an increased amount of shortages, indicating an increased amount of difficulty in meeting water supply and, diminished water supply reliability. So that's what the process kind of did for us. We're able to pick out what was most important, and then to functionalize that in the planning process, we turned those into signposts that we could watch. So, like I'll focus in on climate conditions. If what the modeling showed is that if we were increasingly at risk for hotter and drier conditions, we should probably try to monitor which way conditions were going, right? Whether it's in real time, whether it's in watching the developments in the climate science. But it became increasingly important for us to see whether or not it was truly getting hotter and drier, because if it was, then we would be vulnerable if any of the other things happen, like say high growth. So we signposted growth as well, right? So we look at things like growth projections in our service area. We look at things like new construction permits, where is housing being built? You look at things like where the jobs are being built, right? Those kinds of signposts can tell you whether or not you're headed, or more likely or not headed, for higher growth. And so, this kind of gave us a way of managing what we're really looking for, right? And trying to gather information on the things that were really important to the water supply and demand balance. This next graph is just a listing of the different signposts that we either considered or developed for the different areas of uncertainty. And again, I'll focus in on climate change. Again, precipitation trends, temperature trends, like is it getting hotter? Has it been hotter the last 5 years? What's happening there? What do the global circulation models say for the different areas and the different parts of our watersheds? And then whether there's improvement in things like downscaling that give us more confidence in the indications that are coming out of those climate models. So hopefully you can see there that we're trying to get more specific about what we're watching, so that we're watching the things that are important. Then the next step was taking that information into kind of a practical approach. And so I'm going to try and explain a little bit about how we thought about this, how we thought about implementing this information that we've just developed, and information as we go along. So on the bottom axis, I have time, right? So from a point into the future. And I'm going to have 3 different pieces of information come out. One is called the IRP approach. So that is essentially was our basic plan, like what resources should we develop, whether it's additional water recycling, additional stormwater capture, groundwater storage, surface storage, Bay Delta augmentation, state water project improvements, etc. What projects would we plan to build under our basic look at what the future might be without all of these uncertainties? And so you could lay out a plan of these actions and basically have decision points along now into the future about when you should develop and invest in those things, right? So what we envisioned here is that we also knew from this IRP analysis, this RDM analysis, that potential actions could be taken to augment that basic approach. How would we add to the decision-making process of trying to add to that basic approach? We would use the signposts that we have at critical points of information, right? Or critical points of decision. So say you have a decision point described by this small triangle there, right? We would look at our signposts, and if we needed additional action based on that signpost. In other words, if our signpost said, hey, there's a lot of growth going on, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, right, in the last 5 years or so. When it came time to make a decision on augmenting, you may make a decision to augment there and add to your kind of planned IRP actions. And you would continue to do that by watching your signposts at each decision-making point and adding to your actions if needed. So that's kind of what, you know, what we would call the adaptive approach. We're adapting to the changing signposts to add or slow down our investments to adapt to the changing uncertainties. So, you know, I said that this section would be about evolution of that. So that was 2010 rather. So after the 2015 IRP, we repeated this analysis with RAND. And one thing I want to point to that we changed in the analysis was that we found that for as uncertain climate change is, it's also how do you say, like, relatively unpredictable. I mean, that's uncertainty to begin with, but we found that it was a easier analytical technique for us to use something called a delta method, not to be confused with the Bay Delta, but a delta method for those important things like temperature and precip. And so instead of looking at GCM generated data, so global climate model generated data, what we did was we looked at changes in the underlying temperature and the precipitation in a structured change methodology, so that we, you know, essentially what we were saying was, here's my results. What if it's 2 degrees hotter, you know, over the next 25 years? What if it's 4 degrees hotter in the next 25 years? What if it's 6 degrees hotter? And basically what we were able to do by doing that was simplify the method of downscaling, obviously, from the global climate models. But we interpreted the results differently. What we interpreted the results as is, what is the threshold of change in temperature and precip that starts to cause problems, right? And that kind of fits easier or better into that signposting methodology. And so the next graphic I'll show you is kind of how we thought about that. It's like, so here the axis here is degrees of change in temperature up the, you know, basically up the y-axis, okay? So if I'm able to define that when temperatures rise around 2.5, 3 degrees over the next 25 years, that's when I start to have some issues with supplies and demand balancing and water supply reliability. Basically, what I can look at in terms of the global climate models is, what do the global climate models say about that threshold by 2030, right? So again, if I'm vulnerable to a certain degree of climate change or temperature change by 2030, what does the science say about the plausibility of getting to that threshold level?
Are you talking about Celsius or Fahrenheit degrees?
In this case, I'm talking about Celsius.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, and again, this is just an example, but so this array of dots here, oops, sorry, that did not work out. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. my animation did not work out. These dots are supposed to be representing the global climate models. So, you know, there's a number of different models, just like we used in the first go around, right? 12 different models. This would be representative of the number of models that said by 2030, temperatures would likely exceed that 2.5 degrees Celsius rise by 2030. You know, and conversely, you could look at the ones that didn't get to that level. And that helps to inform you about, what is the science saying, the predominant science saying, what is the plausibility of temperatures changing to the point where it's starting to make a difference, a severe, like a significant difference. So it's just a different way of looking at it. And, you know, frankly, a lot of that was done for computational and interpretational ease, because it really is difficult to take global climate models and downscale them into our service area, our watersheds and service areas, and then run them specifically through the models. So that's one of the reasons, but it's still useful, I guess is what I'm getting at. So I hope that was a good and thorough and complex explanation of what we did up till 2020. I'll say I thought the approach was really good and really comprehensive, but I will say that hardly anybody could understand what the heck we were talking about, right? Because it's so complex. And with our board structure and trying to explain all of this stuff, it really doesn't give you tangible, like a tangible feel for what those what if scenarios are, because there's too many of them, right? 7,000 scenarios. It's really hard to explain to a decision maker or a policy maker and get them to get a feel for what the future really might look like. And so in the 2020 IRP, we made a decision to go to what I think in this uncertainty planning world, an approach that I think is considered a step down from that RDM in terms of comprehensiveness, but is definitely a step up in terms of visibility and understandable, being able to understand it. And so we used in the 2020 IRP a scenario planning process, right? And again, it's because while I'm saying RDM, and I'll continue to believe this, it's more comprehensive, it's really hard to explain and paint out results. And so scenarios let somebody see, like, under these conditions, what is my outcome? Right? So what we did was we went through a whole process of identifying with our stakeholders, with our board, with our member agency managers and staff, identifying what we call drivers of change. So we tried to identify the key drivers that people were either worried about or that are shown or known to cause vulnerability in our ability to either supply water or in our ability to manage demands, right? And so specifically about climate change in this process, we engaged an expert panel of climate scientists and climate experts to help us identify the range of uncertainty associated with climate change, with which we would examine through these more transparent scenarios, right? And so we kind of boiled it down to climate change over the next 25 years is either going to be more moderate or more severe, and it kind of depends on the carbon loading. That's the primary factor, is the carbon loading. And so we looked at, in our different watersheds, the impacts of moderate versus more severe climate change in terms of temperature and precip into the scenarios themselves, right? So when we look at the scenarios themselves, the scenarios are informed by this different drivers of change. So on the left, I have climate change, legislative and regulatory impacts, demographics. So you see it's real similar to what we saw in the RDM process, but instead of doing, kind of continuous ranges of uncertainty and combining them that way, we looked at more ends of the uncertainty ranges to see what the vulnerability or the impacts on our system would be. So I just have, just for organizational sake here, like 2 different scenario inputs for a particular driver that would be incorporated into the scenario planning process. So for climate change, again, the first kind of input was a gradual rise in temperature combined with erratic precipitation, and the impacts on that erratic precipitation based on that gradual rise in temperature. The second input, that's used in the other scenarios to kind of see the impact of the range of that uncertainty, would be rapidly rising temperatures and still erratic precipitation, but also informed by the impacts on that precipitation, rain versus snow versus the rapidly rising temperatures. So we essentially took those two different inputs and put them in two different scenarios, right? And so now the results of those two different scenarios help to describe the range of vulnerability that you have to those inputs. Okay, and so we did the same thing for legislative and regulatory constraints, and we did the same thing for demographics, right? Sluggish and moderate population growth versus strong economy and population growth, right? So two ends of the uncertainty of how the future might look like. What that results in is taking all of these uncertainties and combining them into what I would, say is 4 discrete scenarios that can be compared against one another for the impacts on these uncertainties and described in this way. We had 4 scenarios, scenario A, B, C, and D, right? Fancy names. But we also found in this process that if you pick a name and somebody doesn't like the name, all of a sudden they don't like the scenario. So we just stayed with A, B, C, and D. Scenario A, and you see the axes here. Basically, what we're trying to do is look at the edges of uncertainty that result in greater supply stability versus lower supply stability and lower demands for water versus higher demands for water. And so we have 4 scenarios that combine those uncertainties in such a way that result in transparent, describable scenarios with kind of discrete assumptions that show the impacts of those underlying uncertainties scenario by scenario. So you can see in scenario A, what is our outcomes or risks of shortage if the future is really described by lower demands for water and stable supplies of water? And that's kind of juxtaposed against scenario D on the other extreme, which is what's our water reliability picture look like if we have high demands for water and a reducing or a decreasing amount of imported supply or supplies in total, right? So that we're able to describe that, and B and D, are basically 2 different iterations of the same thing, 2 different combinations of the same thing, but they're described and calculated and quantified by the ranges of uncertainty of the things that are on the left: climate change, political factors, economics, demographics, regulatory issues. Political factors, I should have combined that with regulatory, but so that was the idea of the scenario planning, and it created a very simple framework then, right? On a technical basis, we quantified each driver and the uncertainty impacts and modeled them through our IRP sim model, our magic model, right? Simulated those. Then we looked at each scenario and we looked at what people refer to as a gap analysis. How often and how short of water are we at risk of going out into the future, out through 2045, right? And then we can take that information and identify actions that we can take to minimize that gap, minimize the frequency, minimize the quantity of shortages. And that's how we try to achieve reliability, right? So if we're short a lot of the time, we can look at the different options for developing additional water supply, or maybe water use efficiency, right? Or maybe development of other, groundwater augmentation or recycled water, and measure how well those things do to close the gaps that are described in each scenario. This graphic, I apologize, it can be complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. I have scenario A, B, C, and D, just like I did on the last graphic. These are actually by year going out into the future as modeled by our IRP sim model with the different underlying uncertainties, what the probability of shortage or the inability to meet demands were in each scenario. So not surprisingly, in scenario A, which if you recall was lower demands because you had lower demographic growth, you had kind of stable climate change, you had stable supplies, you don't see any shortages at all. So those 100%, that's 100% of the time under modeled conditions, we were able to meet demands. So that's the case in 2025, in 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045, right? As those underlying uncertainties change, as we described in scenario B, and I think scenario B was if demands are high, if demands are high but supplies are stable, then what happens? Well, you can see in 2025, approximately 1% of the time, or 1% of the conditions that could occur in 2045 would result in shortages. And that's the same for 2030. And then you can see it starts to increase out into the future. 2% of the time, 3% of the time, 5% of the time, we would have issues meeting supplies. So what that indicates to you is that you could look at some sort of supply augmentation or demand management to try and close that gap. I will say that, you know, when folks look at this and they go, oh, 5% of the time, that really means you don't really have a problem, right? It's like, why would you do something about something that has such a small chance of occurrence? And it's this kind of, this weird thing about life, right? Something can have a really low chance of happening, but when it happens, to you, it's 100% of the time, right? So the drought that we're in like today, models would say probably only have a 5% or less chance of occurring, right? That in 100 years or 100 different conditions, we would not have a drought as severe as what we're seeing today. But the fact of the matter is we are having that drought, and it's infecting us entirely. And during that drought, believe me, people are willing to do all kinds of things to make it go away. So when we see this as planners, 5% of the time is actually pretty significant, right? Because it's real impacts to real people if that happens. And so we should think about doing something about that. You can see in scenario C, the results are really similar to scenario B, that if you have low demands, even if supplies are challenged, you have about the same results as if you had high demands and supplies were stable. Where you really run into trouble is scenario D. And you can see by 2045, scenario D conditions result in us being not able to meet water demands, or what people would call a drought or a water shortage, 66% of the time. And so people, you would wonder when you look at that, how can that be versus scenario A? Well, I kind of describe it this way, right? If you don't have a high need for water and you have plenty of water, you're not going to have shortages. That's scenario A, right? But if you have a high need for water and you don't have any water, you're going to have shortages. That's scenario D. And so scenario D says if Southern California is thriving in terms of the economy and growth, which I think is a perfectly plausible outcome out in the future. In fact, it's what we're all hoping for, right? You're going to have a higher demand for water. But if you have severe climate change and you have impacts on, say, endangered species and additional regulatory constraints or contaminants in groundwater, things like that, your current supplies are going to get challenged so that you're not able to meet those increased demands that come from that thriving economy a great deal of the time. So those numbers make sense to me. If you lose your supplies and there's a growing demand for water, you're going to be in trouble if your job is to meet those demands for water. So this basically tells us right? Kind of what the different edges of uncertainties within those major driving factors have as an impact on our ability to meet water supplies. So the question is, if we want to plan for severe climate change and a thriving California, we better identify the resources or the water demand management that's necessary to close the gaps that we see in scenario D. Right, so with that, I have a kind of lessons learned going forward in this evolution of climate change, that, you know, balancing communication and transparency with analytical rigor is very important. I'm a big fan of RDM, but I can't explain it to policymakers and decision makers. And so using what I learned in RDM to help inform the scenario planning process, which is more transparent, I think was way more effective in getting people to understand the risks that we're taking and what we need to do to address those risks if we choose to do so, right? RDM versus scenario planning, you know, RDM is way more technically complex. Scenario planning is more transparent, and better understanding means better decision making for sure, even if it's not as comprehensive. So that's kind of the evolution of climate change planning. You know, I hope I touched on, you know, I didn't say how the climate is going to change. I think my takeaway here is that it's still highly uncertain, but we have a better idea of what these different ranges of the uncertainty, what kind of impact they can have on our water resources balance. And I think that's the end.